Thank you. So yeah, that is the title, and yes, this is a different type of PowerPoint to help me navigate through the paper, but it's not quite the PowerPoints that we've been having today. It's just very basic, um, and even need to still add my internal citations. But anyway. I also need how to learn how to use this. Does this go? That does not do anything. Or does this do it? This does it. So power is one of those everyday concepts which everybody feels like they know what it is. But I'm going to try to make the familiar strange by deriving what might be called a deep concept of power that's related to the basic biological and biosemiotic situation of the organism. As I may get to describe a little later, I'm doing this in the spirit of some of Gregory Bateson's explorations in his later life. But first, let me outline this basic situation of the organism. And the next couple of slides here are basically simply to say organisms are vulnerable. Organisms have to maintain themselves in their autopoiesis, in their self-maintaining, and there are ways that that can be interrupted, interfered with, and so on. So this basic vulnerability is what introduces a concept of power, particularly power over. Now, we've got two concepts of power from the feminist literature, but they're very useful concepts, power to and power over. So first to talk about power to, it's a kind of competence or ability to do things. And you can originate it, if you like, to the idea of organisms finding food and avoiding being eaten and reproducing. And that leads to reproductive fitness, Darwinian evolution, and so on. It's always complementary to concepts of affordance, what the environment allows you to do, and is always limited by the relevant next. And in general, it relates to ideas of efficient causation, or what in some schemes is called first order agency. But what I'm more interested in here is a situation where we're thinking about at least two organisms in which each is part of the environment of each other. Now, this comes from a lot of exposure to sort of Darwinian frameworks. Okay, the organism adapts to the environment. Well, what if the environment is other, especially conspecific organisms? How do you schematize that? This is a social situation, especially if they don't eat each other. It can serve as a basis for thinking of what is sometimes called social power, or in the terminology, power over. Now, I'm not trying to advertise to use power to explain things. That's optional, it's a choice. It's what a lot of us do. We always find it useful sometimes. And furthermore, we must be careful because words have their place in larger ecologies. And especially these cultural concepts of power have taken a role in social struggles against extreme asymmetries. And among humans, there's one researcher who was notorious a few years ago who said it goes all the way back to the differentiation of Homo sapiens from other versions of Homo. Well, different societies have made different solutions to that, but there may have been something like that happening very early on sometimes. And so these asymmetries are exactly what we can illuminate based on autopoiesis, biosemiotics, and systems ideas. I'm not going to separate them, Merdine. I'm going to just go ahead and unite them. In that way, I hope to reframe in an analytic and not an aspirational way our usual ideas of power. Now, that reframe is very much in debt to Gregory Bateson's skepticism of the power concept. I want to say something about that skepticism. He wasn't skeptical about what happens in the human world. He saw what happened in the human world. He knew it. He could see it clearly. He just sometimes described it differently. So perhaps unexplicably, I'm not trying to sell the ideas of power because some of them are already all too popular. And also, I don't have any preconceived notions of organisms, that not that they're always competitive, not that they're usually or always cooperative. I mean, obviously, it's a mixture of these things, but the basic point is they're self-organizing, they're dependent, and therefore vulnerable. And anyone who wants to read Hegel can read Hegel. Uh, let us term one organism A and another one B. When I first started developing my ideas, I thought to say, we're dealing with something that we call power if A is more environment to B than B is environment to A. But they're both environment to each other. What does that mean? So here's how I stated it in 1998. The relationship becomes asymmetric in power if B, in maintaining B's autopoiesis, is observed to respond to the presence and activities of A more than A is similarly observed in maintaining A's own autopoiesis to respond to the presence and activities of B. Okay, so that was from a Maturana conference. The more in that last sentence is misleading if it's taken to indicate a simple quantitative relationship like gravity, which is, however, similarly mutual. The more may refer to a difference in the profundity of the possible consequences of not responding to the other. I'll repeat that. The more refers to a difference in the profundity of the possible consequences of not responding to the other. So that can be rewards and punishments, clearly. In abstract principle, any organism sharing interactions with them in a mutual environment must have some effect on each other. Just the same way that a mouse exhibits a measurable, even if insignificant, gravitational pull on the planet Earth. Not to overstate the gravity metaphor, what's actually at issue is that the organisms are constantly changing within themselves and in their relationships with each other in such a way that they are always co-creating each other's contexts. These mutual changes, where asymmetrical relations predominate, create landscapes of possibility of action, more constraining to some than to others. This phenomenon of relational asymmetry, extreme as even conflictual as it is or can be, does not show power or its lack to be something which is an inherent possession, quote unquote, of one of the related entities. The perceived asymmetrical relation is nested within relations and relations of relations in multiple contexts that create the phenomenon. And this makes the whole situation especially umwelty for human beings. Another way of stating the idea I'm putting forward is in terms of adaptation. I always thought this was completely clear, that B is adapting to A more than A is adapting to B. But to say who's which, it seems that the best way of thinking about it is in terms of risk. Again, going back to that vulnerability piece that I mentioned at the beginning. Risk and vulnerability is greater on the one side than the other. And we're calling that party the adapting party. Of course, there's mutual adaptation going on all the time, but the quote unquote more, if it has whatever meaning it has, would have to do with risk. Adaptation is not simply a simple, not necessarily simple concept. It involves learning and general perception of its surround, Umwelt, and its continued modification of its behavior. Choiceful action in Ecological sense, which isn't what some people mean by agency. It's just something basic to organisms. This is not necessarily conscious perception in terms of today's debates about consciousness. Does this mean that I'm claiming that A can be more Umwelt to B than B is Umwelt to A? Or specifically, would B carry in its neural system a more elaborate model of A than A carries of B? Sometimes certain people live rent-free in your head, so that's being more Umwelt, unless you're living in their head, in which case, Mazel Tov. So, in this position paper that I refer to a couple times, Gregory Bateson suggested that best equivalent for what we mean by power might be approximated by ecological dominance, or what he called prominence. But I can't explain the concept of ecological dominance. It shifts, it slips, it slides. And so I'm going to skip over that. Just to say, it doesn't mean the king of the jungle. Usually the redwoods are considered the ecological dominant of a redwood forest. It's a different concept, but maybe could be made more rigorous than some versions of power. But usually, often ecologists don't really know which is the dominant species in a particular ecosystem. You have to study it. And I say he was skeptical of and avoidant of the concept of power. He didn't like the concept. He was clear about the incidents and what happens in the world. But one time I noticed that he was using it in this relational way. And he wrote that the power ratio between purposive consciousness and the environment has changed rapidly in the last 100 years. That was 70 years ago. And the rate of change in this ratio is certainly rapidly increasing with technological advance. So this idea of the power ratio, again, this is the kind of concept I'm trying to develop here. Now, one potential that this has is that it can emphasize the agency, the interpretive and survival activity of the less powerful side of the interaction. Because often it's the less powerful agents who necessarily involve themselves in these biosemiotic actions, which are involved in the adaptation of the more powerful. So they have more work that they do, interpretive work. In that sense, a certain stupidity can arise in the more powerful. Have you noticed? Far from power being something which is the effect of some sort of skillful action by the more powerful, in the ecological view of power, it becomes clear that such power does not result from superior intelligence or capability on the parts of the dominant, although the illusion that it does comes from all sorts of things, also including a confusion between power over and power to. So the less powerful party, by virtue of its need to learn and adapt, is almost inherently the party that develops intelligence and skill with regard to its interactions with the most dominant party. And in activism, this underlines something that's called standpoint epistemology, for what it's worth. I should note that the analysis I'm developing here also works for organizations, basically systems that are composed of human beings working together, not necessarily so much classifications of people that aren't particularly working together, but that some people put in a classification. There lies madness. But anyway, the corporate groups can also be in this category. And I'm not endorsing any political program with this. Key to all human action, which I'll refer to later. And a big challenge to this whole thing that kind of undermines everything I've been saying is Freud's phrase, His Majesty the baby. Now, in this previous pre-conference, I remember one particular slide, which was of a baby holding in marionette strings the mother. And there you go. So it's complex among human beings and among animals and among organisms. Okay, I'm going to shift and talk about why Gregory Bateson disliked the power concept in general, without talking too much about Robert Moses, who was the subject of a conference where he talked about it the most. He usually considered power to be a metaphor similar to energy, energy in the sort of New Age sense, or in the sort of Actually, not so much even in the New Age sense as in the sort of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic theories floating around like the 1950s, 40s. Inappropriate application of 19th century concepts of physics to phenomena of living things that involve, we might say, biosemiotic action. These Newtonian metaphors, what's going on? He thundered, were inappropriate to what he saw as a realm of mind based on difference. Instead, they implicitly evoked forces and impacts as if organismic relations could be modeled on a billiard table. There's some sound, there's some white sound. I will. Okay, so this usage of power is especially strong in the views that see increase of power as a motivation. No, nothing in the view of power I've been developing supports the idea of being temporary king of the hill in some temporary game is the necessary driving force in the behavior of organisms. But we can't deny the existence of observed dominance of all kinds in many animals and their organisms. However, the idea that this is a key motivating factor is part of our contemporary ecology of ideas. And I say that he was particularly skeptical of what we might call motivational monotheism, the search for a master motivator of human action. I would say he strongly preferred what I call a polytheistic account of motivation as arising from all sorts of other phenomena, such as love and hate and so on. And we must also remember that it is we as observers who construct the games in which we view some organisms as winners or losers. One thing that was always clear in his work was that due to cybernetics, the idea of control of any complex system by a part of that system is an illusion and a fantasy. Control, if it existed, would involve separating oneself from the system, which is impossible. Being in a part-whole relation always places constraints on the part. Given all this, I still have a few of his examples of where power might exist at bottlenecks of information flow, at decision points about what is reward and punished, and at points at which contexts are interpreted and punctuated. Again, we all live in contexts, we all interpret contexts and punctuate them. Okay, no, it was that person. No, it was that person. No, it's my fault. No, it's their fault. He also described a dramaturgical theory of power in which different powers could be interpreted to different parts as if in a play. Even in the real life drama of the court of law, where he said there were different types of power by the judge, the lawyers, the jury, and the policeman at the door. Obviously, this idea relates to the American constitutional concept of separation of powers, may it live and prosper. In this design by the American quote-unquote founding fathers, different capacities were assigned to different parts of the government in a way which by design was intended to prevent the amassing of some unitary concept of power by some determined person or faction. But obviously, this idea that as if power was some kind of quantitative entity to be amassed or maximized like money is one which Gregory Bateson used the term unbiological. This is unbiological. Doesn't mean that the people who think that way or organizations are found, they are found in today's biological world because the world is the biological world, most especially the human world. But it does mean that such behavior is not in the long term conducive to the thriving or even survival of the maximizing organisms. And possibly power behavior places the organism environment system in double binds, which inevitably lead that system to disruptive change or to extinction. Bateson wrote that organisms depend on optima, not maxima. Organisms can have either too much or too little of, and this is a direct quote, protein, oxygen, sex, warmth, entertainment, water, air, etc. The idea of maximization of power is conceptually an application to biological phenomena of metaphors that don't well describe these phenomena. I only have 5. I don't want to skip the questions, but I do want to talk a minute about explanatory principle because Bateson used to write mental logs, imaginary conversations between him and a daughter. And one of them he asked, "What is an instinct?" Daddy, what is an instinct? An instinct, my dear, is an explanatory principle. But what does it explain? Anything, almost anything at all, anything you want it to explain. Daddy, is an explanatory principle the same thing as a hypothesis? Nearly, but not quite. You see, a hypothesis tries to explain some particular something, but an explanatory principle, like gravity or instinct, or we can add power, really explains nothing. It's a sort of conventional agreement between scientists to stop trying to explain things at a certain point. Now, this isn't what I want to do with the concept of power, to use it as that kind of explanatory principle, though lots of people do that. Though not so much as an agreement to stop explaining things at a certain point, more as a way of generating a feeling that explanation has happened, when in fact there's much more to be explained. And there's also sometimes power has become what he called a dormitive principle after Moliere, a concept that puts the reasoning capacity just to sleep. What I want to do to evoke another work of Bateson's is to pick apart the idea of power and see what can be understood about it. And all these caveats are indispensable context to the ideas which I've developed here, and I hope I have developed them in Gregory Bateson's spirit. And this is the only contribution of what might be AI. I typed this sentence in, and it came up with this beautiful wonder of the universe. So, questions, please. Yes.
It resonated so much in my mind I couldn't finish writing actually. Why does it resonate so much? Well, power, on one hand, is somewhat inversely proportional to the rate of imply to learn. So,
Yeah.
inter pares,
Yes.
power is really learning disability.
Yes.
Criterion of power is a measurable quantity, the Newtonian energy-like thing, which seemingly provides us a criterion for ranking the pares, the interpares that you normally equals according to this ranking, the status. Whereas there have been and were other social structures.
Yes.
Community structures.
Yes.
Where, for example, I remember having visited a Mayan village in Mexico, where there was the Mayan Domo, who was definitely not superior in that kind of power, learning disability, just the opposite. Such leaders that structures single out and are about the others.
Yes.
Because of their ability to mediate between them, which places them really at a meta level. So in that sense, their mediating power, which is really disproportionate, which makes them microchromo, is not such a measurable quantitative thing, but it's really qualitative. So
I think that's really important, and I think that's a very important complement to what I've been talking about. It is, in some ways, I think of it as a concept of responsibility that that exists strongly in certain thriving societies, and I think that's a great example.
Well, first of all, you ended citing Bateson saying that power is what puts reason to sleep.
Yes.
And so Charles Peirce distinguishes between brute force,
Yes.
which I would say
Yes.
says explicitly power of reason, in truth, the power of reason and understood as reasonableness, which I find a really interesting category, because it says explicitly that reason, the power of reason is reasonableness. Therefore, when it puts alterity at the heart of logical thought, which I think is extraordinary coming from a logician, pragmaticist as is hers.
Well, that sounds really 19th century to me, and I miss it. Looking around our social scene, I miss it. I would like to see more of what Peirce was talking about. Yes, yes. Alexei.
Easily achieved without dominating one another. So species evolve, they separate resources, they separate time, space, and so on. So why do we need this?
Uh, we don't. I would say that if you can live without it, please do and show the rest of us the way. Yeah.
Even primates.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I mean, I can't do it, obviously. These concepts just keep cropping up, dominance, power, and so on. Although, as Yangmar said, you have to be a little bit concerned about overusing power. I mean, that I am talking about a kind of power that's a bit brute force, and other societies may balance it or mitigate it with certain canons of responsibility that may make it more humane. So I think you have to look at each culture individually in that sense. Otherwise, there's no hope. And we humane in the good sense, yes, yes,
The fact that he said responsibility twice.
yes,
And thought about then how a responsibility. And
sure,
I also had liked before that you said that words of common sense, the danger of them is that they do exist in many
yes,
levels. So isn't it a way to go to make the words say more into different levels, like the responsibility has to do with choice somehow. And here I think about a little bit of perspectivism, like
mm-hmm.
the words soul and body.
Yeah,
When Jesuit priests arrived in Brazil, they wonder whether or not the indigenous population had souls, and the indigenous population wondered whether or not they had bodies.
yeah. Well, that's why I studied anthropology. All these fascinating different situations, different ways that cultures think, have concepts which are similar but a little bit different, and so on. So yeah, absolutely. In something like this kind of exercise, I try to be as analytic as possible and to try to fix the meaning. But in what Gregory used to call the free natural history of what happens in the world, these concepts have their own life. Uh,
I get the sense that the phenomenon you're describing is inherent in the conditions of possibility of certain types of relations.
yes.
But I think maybe we can be more creative in our language. So, other than power, what are some?
I think you don't you don't try for an overarching concept. I think you look to the specific situation. Is somebody being bribed? Is somebody, or implicitly or explicitly? Is somebody being threatened or bullied? Are they trying to apply brute force? Are they appealing to reason? What is the specific mechanism? And then you get to a mechanism. Well, all right. But, what is happening in that specific example? And for example, when Gregory Bateson was dealing with psychiatric sort of situations, schizophrenia and so on, he had a colleague who was always trying to say a struggle for power in the family. He was always trying to look for more specific things that were going on in that family, which I think are a better, if you want to use this metaphor, leverage point for change. I mean, I think this big concept can kind of immobilize us, really. I'm not the only person. I mean, that's not original to me. Okay, thank you all.